But maybe not to contradict Kevin, but I'm a little nervous this morning because I know so many people in this room have a lot of experience on Rainier and working here. And I have actually only been here for 2 years in the park, so I feel like I'm still learning a lot. And even just preparing this presentation, I had to look up a lot of things from questions that some of you submitted to try to start to answer those questions more clearly. And I think there's a lot of questions we're still trying to answer that I'll talk about today. And my office is over in the Tobin building in Longmire, so I'm right over here most of the time. So, and then a little background, I was a plant ecologist here. Before I came here, I was doing my graduate work at the University of Minnesota, and then I was doing a postdoc soil research there. And most of my work was focused on how trees tolerate climate and thinking about how where species grow is controlled by the way they can tolerate drought or freezing. And a lot of that work was actually focused in mountains in Arizona, but that included species from tropical or wetter areas as well, especially in a greenhouse setting. And then right before I came here, we started to use hyperspectral imaging, so using both visible and, to us, non-visible light to detect disease in plants. And I'll talk a little bit about how I'm carrying over a little bit of that work into meadow off-trail impacts in the next year. But before that, I was a tech for the Park Service doing vegetation mapping also in the desert. So it was a big shift to come here, though via the Midwest, so I got some wetter climates. But in some ways, getting to spend time in the meadows and in what is like a relatively harsh environment with short growing seasons has a lot of analogies to the desert, where there's also pretty short growing seasons and pretty stark climate differences where you can see a lot of changes in the landscape in a really small area. So I would really like today to not just talk at you on a Saturday, but to hear more about your experience of the mountain and the questions that you might have about the work that you're doing here and just your own interest and observations. So I was hoping we could start a little bit with some of your favorites of the mountains. Mine are going to be plants almost all of the time, but yours don't have to be plants. And I asked my daughter this morning what were her favorite flowers, and she said green flowers, but I did want to represent a couple green flowers here because I do think sometimes they are the least showy, but are still really important on the landscape. So I put up here the hellebore, of course, which is this huge flowering plant in the lush herbaceous meadows. With these, I think, gorgeous flowers, even though for a good chunk of the year it just looks like a bunch of leaves, and now they seem to be universally attacked by aphids, but they seem to do all right. And then on the right side here is Castanea cryptantha. So this is this cryptic paintbrush that is almost endemic, so almost entirely grows within the borders of Mount Rainier. It was thought to be quite rare, but I think you actually see it in a lot of kind of wet meadow areas all over the park. It's like maybe it's cryptic in that once you start to see it, you can see it everywhere, but before that you don't see it very much. And it doesn't have those bright red or pink flowers that we look for in your big common paintbrushes. It's just a little paintbrush. So does anyone want to volunteer mountain favorite? They're all beautiful. You can't choose a favorite. And so, yeah.
Elephant head.
Oh, yeah. That is such a great one. And that's a nice one, the common name to see in the plant, and you're like, oh, that's elephant head, I know. Does everyone know that one, the pink lousewort? Yeah, that's a great plant. And does everyone here have meadow roving experience or meadow watch or both? Meadow rovers? Meadow watch? Something I missed? And how long? Who thinks they've been doing meadow roving the longest? No? The shortest? How long have you been? Just once? That's great. Well, thank you for doing that work. I'll talk a little bit more about the Paradise Meadow Plan, which led to the formation of meadow roadways and work that obviously is so important and continuing now a little bit later. So, sorry, that text is very, very long. So I'm going to give just a very quick overview of the vegetation program here. So that's the program I manage here at the park. Talk a little bit about sort of the forest to meadows in Mount Rainier, a little bit of background, including some more in-depth look at some of the work we're doing in the vegetation program. And then we'll move on to meadow ecology, off-trail impacts in Paradise. And then work we're doing now, work that, especially if you're a meadow owner, you're meadow watch, you're part of, and our next steps. So the vegetation program here is composed of kind of three large components. Restoration, so that's weed management, that's growing plants for post-construction or post, like off-trail hiking impacts, and then planting them out in the meadows or in the campgrounds. There's also hazard treating work, so I didn't show you, but Kim Kopek and Josh Drown are our restoration lead and our horticulturist, respectively, in restoration. And then Javier Salazar manages our hazard tree program, which is, manages, tries to mitigate dangers in developed areas, but also can give us a little heads up on maybe some new or introduced diseases in the park and help us manage. Oops. I don't know why it's not working. And then also we have a monitoring component, some of which is done in concert with the North Coast and Cascades Network Inventory and Monitoring Program. And the Inventory and Monitoring Program, you might already be familiar with it, is sort of the science arm of the National Park Service. And in this case, the Inventory and Monitoring Program in our region includes Mount Rainier, North Cascades National Park Complex, Olympic, Lewis and Clark, and 4 other smaller parks. And so a lot of the long-term monitoring or inventory work is done through that network, and then we do some of that work here. So I'll talk a little bit about white bark pine monitoring, which has been a big focus this year. Okay, so before we get into the meadows, which I guess depending on your interest in what you're doing maybe is what you experience most while you're here at the park. I want to start a little bit with the forests, which cover about 60% of Mount Rainier space. So this is from Franklin's Forests of Mount Rainier, Forest Communities of Mount Rainier from 1988. And there's kind of these great garish but potentially colorblind friendly colors on the map show where all the forests of Mount Rainier. So the forests ring most of Mount Rainier, going from 5,000 feet down to where we are below now. And our forests are quite old, quite stable generally, but of course we have issues. So anybody who lives among the trees has to deal with the fact that unfortunately trees aren't just static things that live out there, that they get diseases, that snow will break them down. And so one of the things that we do within the vegetation program is assess hazard trees. So most of the mitigation, so the felling of the tree or the decision to close a site or the decision to relocate a campsite or permanently close it, happens through the facilities and management program, which takes on all of the hard work of actually felling trees safely, or we contract that out. Or Visitor and Resource Protection Division, who has to, tell campers or people that they can't camp somewhere or park somewhere until we can deal with the tree. But we do the assessment, which means looking at a tree for defects, for disease problem, and then bringing in expert consultation if needed. So of course that can happen, and here are just some trees that Javier documented where he wanted them to be felled. They weren't able to be felled before the next season, and then they failed sometime in between there. So luckily those were at closed sites and no one was hurt when the trees failed. And of course hazard trees in the park are a combination of 2 things. It's a little bit, I think all hazard tree trainings involve some variation on like if a tree falls in the forest joke, because what it is what can it hit? So if the tree can't hit anything we've deemed valuable, so a person, a structure, then it can't ever be a hazard tree, even if it is really the most unhealthy tree you've ever seen in your whole life. And then so how likely is it to fail? So it has to it has to be able to hit something, and then it has to be likely to hit that thing to become a hazard tree. Otherwise, it is just a tree in the forest, and we are generally unconcerned about it. And so most of the time, what we're dealing with when we deal with hazard trees is Javier goes through the forest and looks for individual trees that have issues. But every once in a while, there can be an issue with hazard trees that is like a landscape scale event, which we've had in Cougar Rock Campground recently. Has anyone been up to Cougar Rock or camped at Cougar Rock? And have you noticed anything about the landscape at Cougar Rock Campground? No. So it's had, Cougar Rock is in the little square there, and all of these pink points are like spaces on the map are from an aerial detection survey, which is run by U.S. Forest Service Forest Health Division, and then Washington and Oregon State Natural Resource Divisions. And this is found, that is highlighting some forest disease in the park. So you can see those various spots. A lot of the ones up in the northeast part of the park are white pine blister oaks, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Or there are some diseases of fir, but sometimes it's just that they can detect those diseases. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how to make it. No. Not autoplay. But so at Cougar Rock, what it's detecting is this fir engraver outbreak. So there's a lot of silver firs at Cougar Rock. Many of them are young trees, and these fir engravers are bark beetles. They burrow into the bark of the trees. They leave this. Sorry, I need to pause because it's going to go me off because it keeps playing all the time. Okay, so the fir engraver burrows into the bark, and this like straight, perfect horizontal line, I don't know how they do it, is the fir engraver, the adult. They burrow in there, they lay all the eggs along the line, and then the larvae come out, and they eat the sapwood. So any one incident of this is not that big a deal for a tree. It's not welcome, but certainly it wouldn't kill them. But silver firs have this unique combination of being not very drought tolerant, which means water stress, like having a beetle break up all your water movement and sugar movement, is not great. And they're growing at Cougar Rock, where it's been both highly impacted because it's a campground. So it's been stomped on all the time. Probably like small children are burying their hatchets in them occasionally. Just like, it's not a great place to be a tree. And there are a ton of beetles. So the silver fir have been dying. So there's a little fir engraver. They're quite tiny. They're native beetles, and they're just around. Interestingly enough, we've had hundreds of silver fir die at Cougar Rock, but not really outside the campground. So silver fir live all over the place here. It's a pretty common tree at this elevation, especially at Cougar Rock. But they're only dying in the campground. And so that's bad news for Cougar Rock, and especially this year I thought we were going to be sort of over the drought because we had so much snow, but then we had heat dome, and so now I'm not sure if the beetle outbreak will continue. I was hoping it would be done. But in general, the forests of Mount Rainier are really stable. So this is the age classes, again from that Franklin paper. And so many of our forests are, over 200 years old, up to 1,000 when you get over to the Grove of the Patriarchs, and then have burned for 1,200 years. And so while our disturbed forests in Mount Rainier are experiencing potentially higher mortality because it's getting drier, it's getting hotter, and now they've been stomped on for, up to 100 years or more. The forests, in the mature forests in the wilderness areas in Mount Rainier, what we've been finding from our forest monitoring work here, in connection with the North Coast and Cascades Inventory Monitoring Network, is that we are not seeing an increased mortality in our mature forests, which is contradictory to basically a lot of other research out there now that's just saying globally forests are dying, which means we're lucky here so far. And so trees that are being disturbed might be getting pushed to that point where they're actually dying a lot more. Our forests, if we can conserve them and keep them within these like protected buffers, they might have a little bit more stasis or more ability to like resist the change that's happening than trees in other parts of the world, which is pretty incredible because when we started to analyze our forest data, we assumed that trees would be dying more, but they're so far just not, which is great because it's one of those, I think when you think about land loss and habitat change and climate change, it starts to be a really gruesome story where we're on this downward slide and everything's going to turn horrible. But here so far, it's not, which means that there's a lot of time to do something different. So that's a nice little story about the forest. Does anybody have any forest questions? Forest thoughts?
This isn't exactly a forest question, but you said the trees in the campground are being stomped on. So by that, do you mean feet?
Oh yeah, so I mean like the root zones of the trees. Yeah. Yeah, so the root zones of the trees, especially the conifer trees here, but so arborists think of the root zones as it's for every inch of diameter of the tree, there's like a foot of critical root zone. And then most of the roots of these trees are within the top foot or less of soil. So they're really out there, and that's where they're like gathering all their resources. And so it can be really impactful to get stepped on a lot. Some of it just could be that they can't develop roots as well. And it might also just mean, water doesn't, if the soil is really compacted, it starts to become a little bit more like cement rather than like a nice way where nutrients and water infiltrate the soil. So it can create a situation where even though we're getting so much water, the trees aren't getting the water that they would like in the area, or their roots aren't spread out evenly. So that's what I think. Do you have a question?
I was just wondering if you had any idea why the forest around here is so healthy in comparison to the other areas. I mean, is it because all the monitoring and the things that we're doing? Or?
And it's interesting because this is the trend from the Olympics of the North Cascades and Mount Rainier. So I think it's a regional effect of we're still going to have dry summers, maybe like increasingly dry summers. But we haven't had a total loss of precipitation. Though snowpack is obviously kind of becoming maybe more variable, not always less. But I don't know, that's a really good question. That's something we were trying to figure out, and we were using some climate data to see what would explain basically less mortality than we expected.
If we're doing something right, I mean, we want to keep that happening.
Yeah, and I think it might just be, some of it is the selection bias of the study, which is they're studying mature forests. So maybe if we did the same forest plots, but in an area where like there had been a lahar within the last, a flood outbreak within the last 50 years, and it was like a younger part of the forest, it wouldn't be the same. But it might just be that the forests here are they can grow a really long time until something really bad happens. Like there is a lahar, there's a fire, and then they'll regenerate from that. So it might just be that if we can kind of continue avoid the introduction of new pests or well, we can't really avoid the lahar, but we not log in an area, then we haven't disturbed it, and it can just kind of continue growing the way it would. Yeah, more to come on that.
Beth?
Yeah.
I was in the Hoh Rainforest in July, and we hiked quite a ways into the river valley.
Yeah.
And I thought I was seeing a huge amount of mortality in younger trees there.
Yeah.
Is that something that y'all
Yeah,
are-
we were looking at that, and there is this hard thing to tease out, which is like what we were calling larger trees, what was called larger trees in that study is like 76 centimeters in range, which is a big tree. But there were kind of some varying signals where like some younger, maybe not seedlings, but like
Yeah.
sapling trees were dying at different rates. And we couldn't just quite tease out the signal of that. So it is possible that that's happening, that those trees are experiencing, that big trees kind of have access to what they need because they're big and established.
Yeah.
And the younger trees are really getting hit hard by those changes in weather conditions.
Yeah.
So it certainly will be sort of on the horizon for the next round of monitoring to see if we can, I mean, hopefully that's like just an odd signal, but I know we were all surprised, kind of just like, no, this must be wrong. They must be dying, and we had to tell ourselves, no, this is a good story. This is happy news. Yeah, but it will be good to see what's happening in more detail.
What was the general age range by mature? 100, 500?
Yeah, I don't actually know. I don't have a good idea of say, okay, if we have a 35-inch Douglas fir, how old that tree is. So I can say, I mean, I think the plots are selected for mature forests, so those are almost always going to be probably at least 200 years old. So that's what I would guess, at least for the biggest trees. But they're also studying within these forest monitoring plots, like, recruits, so like young saplings, some small trees, which would still, I mean, I would still kind of consider larger trees when I looked at them, which are just, less than 30 inches or something. So there's a good mix within the plots, and they're quite large too, since of course the trees can take up a lot of space, so the plots are large enough to capture, up to hundreds of trees on a plot.
This may be getting off track, but
Yeah.
does the forest undergrowth, do they compete with the meadow? If you have a meadow right next to a forest, does one try to?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And there's a lot of research out there about forest, like tree encroachment into meadows especially, with the idea that like meadows are often a successional stage, so part of the change from nothing to potentially forest, depending on where they are, and that a lot of the controls on maintaining the meadow, because those meadow systems are the space between forest and tree line in a way, is, say, snowpack or weather conditions, which make it hard for large trees to flourish. And so there are maybe sometimes contradictory evidence, but here at Mount Rainier, it's been proposed that climate change is a lot of the reason that maybe there's more trees, more subalpine firs as you walk into Paradise, where snow play is, and in that sort of huckleberry low meadow there. There's a lot of subalpine firs there, and they maybe weren't there when you look at historic photos, that it's climate change that's helping those trees flourish. So they would come up now and then anyways, but maybe having really heavy snows for multiple years would mean that a relatively slow-growing tree that needs to be upright is not going to do well, whereas the huckleberry or a lupin can bounce right back from the snow load. There's also the potential that some of those trees were more heavily managed by indigenous groups in the area, and so it could be a combination of multiple factors, like if there was burning or just removal from any means of some of those trees that could have also maintained the meadow landscape. But yeah, there certainly is this thought that trees will take over if conditions are right, and maybe they're becoming more right at our lower elevation meadows now.
The Grand Park comes to mind, where you can see the big trees and pure meadow, and it looks like a tiny forest.
Yeah, like the little type, they're very,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, and so I think it's, the idea behind tree encroachment encouraged by climate change is that the conditions are becoming more right for those trees to continue to grow to higher statures, and then they can obviously crowd out the plants that are below their canopy.
Do the plants, the trees need fungus and other stuff that builds a network, the meadows don't really need that, or do they do
No,
their
they
own thing?
do, though I have to tell you, I don't know that much about like the meadow mycorrhizal networks and how that works. I was just talking to someone who said they thought that carex didn't need like mycorrhizae, which is like we have carex spectabula, like showy sedge and black sedge are pretty common in our meadows. But a lot of plants do have some association with fungus. And it's probably really important for the way they get nutrients and things. It's just a necessary symbiosis. So I would assume that those exist within the meadow, but I don't know that they're compatible or incompatible with those in the forest. But certainly it would be interesting to know if that's like helping push meadows out if there's a different mycorrhizal network forming. Yeah.
So do you encourage or do you want the trees to encroach in the meadows, or is that something you want to maintain the meadows, correct?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, the Park Service, of course, the basis of it is the Organic Act, which is to conserve things as they were into the future. But things like climate change, these massive scale things, do throw a slight wrench into that. Because what does that mean? Do we just, there are some proposals that are sort of like, kind of steward this natural change that's going to happen, but there are certainly other resource management goals that think about things like assisted migration, where maybe you move species to where they're going to thrive next, so you don't lose them. And the Park Service right now has started to put forth some other ways to think about that our conservation mandate. And one thing they did is propose the RAD framework, which stands for Resist, Accept, Direct. So resist would be something like maybe we remove trees from the meadows or use some management techniques that would change, like prescribed fire in certain areas to keep the place as we want it to be and as where we think how it should thrive and what is historically accurate. Accept would just maybe be more on the scale of, well, the meadows are all moving upslope, more trees here, but that will mean, you just have to hike 300 feet higher to see what would have been right at Paradise before. And then direct might be more on the scale of, well, we don't want to lose this species that's getting overtaken by subalpine fir. So we're going to find a spot where it can grow really well and transplant it there. And here in the meadows, we're really a little bit more on the resist right now, as we talk about with restoration and trying to take impacts and return them. And some of those are just social impacts, right? But to return them to the way they were so that the meadows look as they have been. But there certainly is, as part of that, an opportunity to think about whether we need to be a little bit more adaptive in the way we respond to those.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move up a little bit. I'm not going to trees just yet, so I'll talk a little bit about white bark, and then we'll get into our beautiful herbaceous meadows. But so here is, if you could kind of remember, the forests are all in the lower elevations, and now here all in green are subalpine areas, so about 5,000 feet-ish and up, to alpine, where we're getting more towards tree line, so like 6,500, 7,000 feet and up until we see more permanent fill fields, snow fields, those sorts of things. So white bark pine are one of our tree species that is this sort of charismatic indicator, especially in the northern part of the park, subalpine to And the tree is important to us here at the park because it's one of our trees, so all the trees are important to me, but also because it's been proposed to be listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act because it's been heavily impacted by white pine blister rust. So this orange fungus is bursting forth from the stem of the tree. And the rust is an introduced fungus, so it was introduced from Eurasia in general, where it's a native pest or native fungus on pines there. And it has an alternate post life cycle. So ribes, it grows on ribes and then its spores transfer to a pine and then it goes back to ribes, or in our case, ribes, loudsport, or paintbrush species, so far that we know about. And it affects the tree through the leaves, grows down to the stem, and then just starts to use water and nutrients from the plant. And over time, it can girdle the stem. So a single infection doesn't kill the tree. But what happens is that multiple infections, or an infection that spreads all the way to the main stem of the tree, can just stop it from moving water and nutrients. And so the whitebark here are primarily in this green area in around Sunrise in the northeast part of the park. But there are some oddballs that are at Mildred Point and then maybe over to like Indian Henry's, but I haven't seen yet. But so there are still a few whitebark around in other places too. And of course we have western whites that are also similarly susceptible to the fungus. So western white pines will start to see a little bit around Cougar Rock, but then at Ricksecker Point and up there's western whites along the road. And they're also dying from white pine blister rust. And so I'm hoping we can learn a little bit more about them in the future too. But the rust was introduced here in the early 1900s, and there are areas where we experienced over 50% mortality for the trees in a single area, and on average we've had 60% loss of our whitebark pine individuals in the park. Some areas better than others, like around Mystic Lake, those populations look kind of relatively good. We're lucky here in the park because we also don't have high incidence of mountain pine beetle, whereas whitebark pine in the Rockies, where it is, where a lot of the research has been done on the trees, they've had up to 72% loss of their mature whitebark pine from mountain pine beetles, which is a native beetle like that fern viper I showed you earlier. And then they also have rust. So we don't have the sort of 1-2 punch here, so for that we're pretty lucky. And another thing that is exciting about this maybe saddle tail is that whitebark here in the park are showing a lot of this remaining whitebark are showing a lot of resistance to the rust. So here is Josh Brown, who's a horticulturist, climbing a whitebark tree up above. This is in Green Park, so above Hidden Lake and the Palisades Lake area. And you can see the cone cages. I think you can see them on the tree now. And so he's changing cones to keep Clark's nutcracker out. And Clark's nutcracker are the primary disperser of whitebark pine seeds because their cones don't open. So they rip apart the cones. So if we want to collect the cones and collect the seeds, they have to be caged. And then Josh will have to reclimb that tree later this month to collect those cones. And we'll send them off to a Forest Service lab. We'll grow up the seedlings, infect those poor little seedlings with rust, and determine if they're resistant or not. But in the process of doing that, what we found is a lot of the remaining big cone-bearing trees at Sunrise are highly resistant to rust. So, I mean, just in the way that, I guess evolution works, you can experience a lot of death, but the remaining trees are more likely to produce offspring that won't keep dying from the rust. So there's a sort of positive outcome. And we're hoping the same will be true of some of these big trees that we find in other areas of the park that haven't been tested yet. And I didn't have a picture, but some of our other employees crafted a tong so they could, without climbing a tree, could cage cones. And so they did the same for trees and Panhandle Gap and Summerlin, which we really don't know very much about. So it's going to be really exciting to see if those trees, especially in that Summerlin Panhandle Gap area, we were having huge mortality events, if the remaining trees there are like more resistant, and we can use them for restoration in the future. Okay, so now move on up to the meadows. So I want to talk a little bit about just meadow ecology, the vegetation types we have, and the vulnerability to impacts. And then we can move on to detecting those impacts and what we're doing about them. Okay, so here is an illustration. This is from 2020, not this year. I should have updated it. But that blue line, of course, is our average snowpack with variation. So this was 2020 where we saw a high snowpack, and then it maybe it melted out a little bit earlier. This year, I think it would be like a straight line down from snowpack from the middle of June to July. But so obviously we have a lot of snow at Paradise and a really, really short growing season for the plants. I feel like the snow just melted and now it already looks like fall up there. So here's and if you might experience this question a lot if you're out roaming in the meadows or doing meadow walk. When is peak bloom in the meadows of Mount Rainier?
So
Does anybody get asked that question about have like a ready answer?
we usually tell them somewhere between the last week in August and the first couple weeks of, the last week of July and the first couple weeks of August.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. So it is like maybe on average 45 days after the snow melts is like kind of like it. And I thought it was really interesting that, so this is from a field goal Barkheimer and Hillary Slambers. So Yannicka Hillary Slambers runs the Meadow Watch program. This is a paper about the phenology, so when species are in flower in the meadows. And it's starting with plants that are either on a ridge or a slope, but they're about Jackson Visitor Center up to Panorama Point. And in 2 years, so the red is when the snow actually melted early. And then the green is in a typical year. And what they were finding, which is really interesting, is that when the snow melts as it's typical, you get like a better peak bloom. Like all the species are kind of in flower at once. But if the snow melts at a different time, the spread is different. So they're not actually flowering earlier, which seems a little odd. Like you think, oh, they'll just flower earlier. But they're like, down here, they're flowering for a lot longer. And so what they were finding is that the meadow, like each individual species responds differently. So they're forced when we have a short growing season and the snow melts in whatever time that is, which is like early July. Then they all have to bloom at once, and then they all have to go into fall at once. But if the snow melts early, some species respond early and some species do not. And so it makes this like flat time where we can either get more species in bloom or you can just be delayed. And it's just kind of an odd thing to think about in the meadows, that timing could change, but also that the species, like getting the same number of species flowering all at once could also change too. Like those perfect photos that everyone's coming up to get to post online or on Facebook could have different flowers in them. I was also curious about the fragility of meadows. And I've talked a lot about that with people because the meadows are so fragile to stomping, but yet at the same time when I look at that snow picture and how much snow is on the ground almost all of the year, and yet we can have these like lush, gorgeous meadows, which can also be like heavily impacted by, this like off the road of 30 goats just stomping all over them, and yet the meadows aren't dying. But when we walk all over them, they can look like this, And I was going to talk a little bit about the types of vegetation we have and then why they're maybe fragile. But I want to start personally thinking about the meadows as not fragile, but that they are the same way we all are, would not appreciate being walked on. So it's a little different. They're actually incredibly tough and have this high resistance to a lot of disturbance, just maybe not the disturbance that we give them, which is like the repeated stomping. Okay, so we'll start. I've arranged the sort of briefs on the vegetation communities from least vulnerable to stomping. That's what we think to most vulnerable to stomping. So these types of meadow communities were first put forth by, or that I've read by Henderson in their thesis in 1974. And then when Gina Rochefort put together the Paradise Meadow Plan, this is what she used to think about how vulnerable each of these communities were to stomping or being impacted by overland off-trail travel. So the wet sedge meadows, these are areas where there's very often water near the surface. So it's where you see the shooting stars, you'll see little divots and water gathering. The black sedge is really common in these areas. And then you might see the gentian. And these are thought to be just less vulnerable to stomping. I would think if you stomped on them enough, you might change the way water moves in the landscape. But maybe because it's so wet, they're like a little bit more resilient, and they have a little bit more access to resources, so they could recover if they are stomped on. It might also be that people don't like to stomp in wet meadows as much, so that helps them as well. And I will say each of these meadow communities, they're set up, so sometimes you look at a map of Paradise, they'll be broadly outlined, but I'm sure you know as you walk through there, you could go from like a little tiny wet meadow at the edge of a trail to suddenly like a showy sedge to a heather within a really short space. So this is like each of these communities can be pretty close to one another. They're the dry grass meadows. So the green fescue is really common here. I think this is like, oh, these are like the meadows at sunrise, but this also occurs in Paradise. It just seems it's not as expansive maybe in some areas. The Eucephalus logopholis, which is maybe one of our later bloomers, I think just a couple weeks ago it felt like the meadows were just abuzz with bees, and they were all on these cascade asters, which were just like lush and in bloom after it felt like everything else was already done. And these are also maybe a little bit less vulnerable. Henderson noted that poppy gophers love these dry grass meadows, and they're like a common source of disturbance and maybe actually really great for aerating the soil and these dry soils. And of course the dry grass meadows are often the first to melt out. So they're, even if they're high elevations and harsh environments, they're getting the first sun, and then they have a longer dry season, like a longer soil dry season than some of the other meadow types. There are low herbaceous meadows. So the alpine aster, the pussy-toes, and this kind of like low-drying woolly one, and then the partridge foot are really common. So this is a community that's a little bit more vulnerable to stomping. They're more perennial plants. They retain some above-ground structures for a while, and so and they have less access to water. So this is a community that would be more likely to have a longer dry season. So if they're impacted during that time, it just might take more resources from them. And then there's the lush herbaceous system. So these are the ones I think of as like, this is what you want to see in peak bloom. The Citrobularium is really common. The hellebore, magenta paintbrush, the lupins are like from our lush herbaceous system. And this is another system that is kind of vulnerable to trampling. It's a bit wetter than the low herbaceous, and there's a lot of commonality, but it has a lot of above ground tissue that it's pushing up for flowering and for photosynthesis. And so just a loss of that, if it gets stomped on, can be really impactful on the plants. then the heat shrub systems, so these are starting, 5,500 feet or so up to 7,000 feet. With the pink heather at lower elevations, maybe with the Cassiope, and then moving into the yellow heather to be at higher elevations. And these systems are thought to be really vulnerable to trampling. So each heather, some of the heather stems that are above ground can be 70 years old, and some of the plants can be older than that. And of course they're woody plants, so that's years of investment in tissues. And it doesn't take that many steps on a heather to break off, to break off a stem. And they also will put a lot of investment into buds for the next year. So plants that are woody, plants that put buds on, like an investment in their next year's growth, are really vulnerable to trampling because they can lose like multiple years of resource investment. And they're also really slow to recruit. So their offspring are not as often successful, right? So they might need wetter conditions. I know we've found with restoration from reports from the staff here that planting out heather is actually really likely to fail. So it'll take a long time to grow the plants, and then a lot of them die when they're transplanted. So this is both a vulnerable system to trampling, much more vulnerable than the herbaceous systems potentially, and it's really hard to replace them. So when we think about talking to visitors about it, it's like, well, none of the plants want to be stomped on. But these systems are often growing at even slightly higher elevations and are just losing a lot more for every step. And then does anybody have any questions about these meadow types? So there was a question about meadow succession and what are the kind of first plants in. And so, yeah.
Where did the early bloomers fit in? The lilies, the
Oh, yeah.
flower?
That's a good question. So it's like, they're just not they weren't listed as the dominant species. So the past flower, I think I would put in between the lush herbaceous and the heath shrub. Just say I probably like more into the lush herbaceous. Showy sedge, probably about the same. Of course, there's lots of crossover there, so a lot of the species will grow in one or the other. I'm just thinking right at our restoration site now, which is right along Dead Horse Creek, below it's like reconnection with Skyline Trail. There's both, just a little bit above that, there's heather coming in, but there it's like lupin and leukia and anemone and a little bit of paintbrush and cascade. So I think sometimes there can be a lot of crossover, but I would think, yeah, these are the sort of dominant species that they're thinking of, so maybe you have to say, oh, I see that one, and I also see a bunch of the Sitka valerian here. I must be in a lush herbaceous meadow. And so the meadows, of course, are constantly going through change, and sometimes one area could transition slowly to become, you could transition from a wet meadow to, with a change in maybe hydrology to a lower herbaceous or lush herbaceous meadow over time. And of course, a lot of these meadows are formed after there is some change in the landscape, or there was over time a pullback of the glacier over thousands of years. And so, in Henderson's thesis, they noted that these were the earliest successional species. So this is wood rush over here, only saxifrage, areognum, of course the partridge foots, black sedge, maybe not as common in the Paradise area, but the newberries, virginises, polygonum, and then some juncus, and this little hairy cap moss. So those are the earliest, but we also get things like, maybe not long after, but not the earliest, lupin, because I think of lupin as like can be so abundant on the landscape early, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, we're going to try seeding with lupin in some areas to see if that will sort of help move things along by like adding nitrogen to the soil over time. And then I have a really awesome question about what's paradise for marmots. And the restoration crew this year has a marmot they named Nigel at their site. And Nigel's getting a little aggressive with them, even though they're planting out just a ton of what I would think would be really delicious plants for Nigel the marmot to grow. And there was a really interesting paper on, well, okay, how are marmots changing the landscape? It was still an Olympic, but a lot of the same things are here. So I'm curious, what kind of impacts do you think marmots have on meadow vegetation?
They seem to be eating all the time.
They seem to be eating all the time.
They're constantly eating.
I'm always watching them, and I'm like, what are they, or they have a, like, what is the thing that they're eating? And so marmots do, and here's a little pile of marmots I found last year, and there were at least 4, but I think 5 of them, and they were just, it looked really nice to be a marmot that day. So marmots do have kind of like the paper called them palatable and unpalatable, but they have kind of like a yuck and yum scale of plants that they like, even though I still kind of suspect that they're eating like a lot of everything a little bit at a time. So lupins, they seem to like them. Maybe some of these polygonals they like. Potentially now is a fan of the cinquefoils, tomatillas, or veronicas. And so in this study, they, the author monitored the difference in species abundance by where marmots lived and just in the broader meadow. And they found that, let's see, that the species that they really liked became less abundant right where the marmot lived. So they wander out of their marmot mounds, and then they eat like all the lupin there. Whereas they would leave all the veronica. So on this really small scale in the landscape, and they didn't think it had a big impact on the whole meadow, they were actually reducing lupins and I think, what else are we eating? It was definitely the Eriogonum. And other things I found palatable. They were reducing them right in their little landscape, but not to the point of extinction, just like those were less abundant than, and then they would have these little piles of veronica, not because they liked them, because they didn't like them. Of course, which is kind of the anti-gardening for us, where we have all of the plants we do like right in our house.
Beth, do seeds remain viable through their system? Like, are they pooping out viable seeds?
That's a good question. I would assume that they would, at least some of them. I don't know. I'm curious how much they're eating the seeds versus the above ground tissue. Like, they must eat the fruit of some things, but maybe not others. I also don't know where marmots poop. Do they poop in their little warrens, or?
I've seen scat like around the outside of their mounds,
Yeah.
but I don't know how much there might be inside.
That would be
or
really
something.
interesting.
Yeah.
That if they are eating seeds, it's still viable. If they are like investing in sort of a long term. It's like a marmot seed bomb for their area. That's a really cool question. I'll have to get some intern on that.
So what is their positive impact
What's their
in the
positive?
environment? Is there a positive impact that they have?
Well, I guess in some ways they are maintaining a little bit of diversity across the landscape, right? Like they're, yeah, I presumably they're fertilizing at least a little bit. They're providing a little joy to the rest of us. Yeah, but I guess, and I don't know, I mean, I think,
They are prey for some of the predators
yeah,
too.
they are prey. It's so hard to think of them as prey
I
because they're
know.
so large, but they certainly must be predated
We get
upon.
some big ones, don't we? Marmots.
What are the primary predators of marmots?
I believe lynx and probably,
Coyotes?
I have heard that bears, sorry?
Coyotes?
Probably coyotes. I don't know how high up the coyotes are getting
I
these
guess
days.
especially little marmots must be really vulnerable.
Yeah.
They're just like little.
Yeah, foxes maybe even.
Yeah.
Lots of eagles.
Yeah, eagles.
Either eagles. Bears occasionally?
Yeah,
They
I
are
suppose
bear
bears will just, we'll try a little bit of everything,
Yeah.
so. Okay, so then I'll talk a little bit about the restoration program here at Mount Rainier. And before I jump into planting, I want to include a few slides from Sam Kovac about the invasive plant management, which here I think is a huge part of restoration. So we obviously have a lot of invasive plants at Mount Rainier, just like everywhere else. Invasive species aren't anything that's like introduced. They're plants that are introduced and that are basically likely to take off, so to actually thrive in an environment, and then to disrupt either the local ecosystem or to cause economic harm. So they're plants that are likely to establish themselves really well, like this oxide daisy here, which we could presume before it grew on this hillside, there were some native plants that popped into place there too. And the weed management here in the park, I think, is both critical to maintain our native system. So often our weeds are coming in, like on the roadsides or, in developed areas where people start off, right? Where the weeds, it's a common place where we're bringing our cars and our dirty boots and all those things. But they can obviously move into wilderness areas where one, it's really hard to manage them, and they could displace a lot of native plants and then displace native animals or disrupt habitats before we can control them. And an interesting thing about weeds is that they are kind of all alike one another. So they come from fairly few plant families. And so the weeds around the world are more similar to each other than they are different, which means that if we just let weeds go, all the plants will be not maybe the same species, but in a temperate area like this, it'll start to look kind of the same. So everything will be kind of the same wherever you go. Instead of seeing the diverse plant community and the wildlife that depends on that, that you would when you go to each unique place, and then like the long evolutionary history of a place, you'll see like a bunch of daisy-like plants and a bunch of rose-like plants, and it'll be pretty similar across the globe, which is kind of sad. You want to go to a place and see something unique and get to be in the environment. So I think about weed management as a way to maintain a connection, to maintain that conservation mandate for the connection to what the place should look like, and the product of like its whole history. So through here, what we do is first we try to find weeds before they really get established. So priorities are often new populations of potentially invasive weeds, rather than like dandelions, which actually are around but not too bad in the park and are just everywhere. It would be hard to control dandelions, but if we have a new hawkweed species that's just brand new, maybe we can get it gone before it actually establishes. Then there's a lot of manual and chemical treatments, whatever will basically do the least amount of harm to get rid of the weed before it becomes established. And then of course we map and monitor them so we can see if we make problems. And then this is what we like to tell everyone how you can help. Cleaning off your shoes. I know my yard is full of weeds. Before I come to work, I have to clean my shoes so I don't introduce weeds outside of Longmire where it's really pretty weedy. Also, if you know of the weeds in the area, you can document them and send them in. I know that Kim has been working with Darren Swinney, our GIS specialist, on having, like we have a wildlife reporter, sort of a spot where you could report a weed. Because that could be really useful in finding new populations before they take off and assist in early detection. And I'm hoping I requested to get like the boot brushes that they sometimes have, to have maybe a few trailheads to see if we can both encourage people to clean off their boots before they go up the trail, but we also would be very interested in knowing what germinates from those boot brushes, like what weeds are getting stopped. I think would be kind of a fun way to do it. So that's, even when we're managing, say, construction projects in the park, our like most common thing for the, just like, well, just make sure the trucks are clean and the, make sure everybody's stuff is clean, because that reduces the import of weeds just a lot. Yeah. So that's kind of the preventative restoration part. But then you have a restoration program in the park that's aimed at restoring to the way it was by sort of adding to the landscape rather than subtracting. And our restoration program here, the way we're doing it now is traced to, a lot of the is traced to the Paradise Meadow Plan and this documentation of off-trail impacts. So here, of course, is a perfect meadow. There's no arguments to be had. This meadow is perfect. It's got all the plants. It looks like a mix of like sort of a heat shrub and maybe a lush herbaceous meadow. We've got all our species there. It's great. But we know that not all of our meadows, though many of them do, look that perfect. And of course, it's because we've got a long history of impact. And this is like my favorite. I know the golf course was very short-lived, like maybe 1 year, but it's still a mix of sad and humorous. There was a golf course here in the park. So it was kind of great views, right? So we've had a lot of off-trail impacts since the formation of the park. And some of these can really scar the landscape. So everything from, either this was from people walking off the trail in snowmelt, or maybe it's just the way the water was running off the trail. So walking through the meadow or walking up to the site. So in 1986 and 1987, the staff here, including the park botanist at the time, Gina Rochford, started a study to map all of these off-trail impacts in the park. And so they used aerial imagery. So here's all of our Paradise trails. They used aerial imagery and then on-the-ground work to document all of the trails. They documented the vegetation types that they were in. They documented the length of the impact, the width of the impact, and then also how deep they were. And then they used that all to basically calculate an erosion potential. And the community type was used to multiply. So if it was, the erosion potential is increased if it was like in a heath shrub community where we know they're much more vulnerable to impact than if it was in that shooting star, low, wet, herbaceous meadow. And what they found was this terrible pink set of social impacts in the area. And what it was about double the length of trails at the time, and it might actually be more. And that led to the Paradise Meadow Plan, which at the time was a 5-year plan to restore the worst of these trails, but also to delve more into like, why is this happening? And part of that plan was super ambitious, and it's really fun to read because it's also about thinking about, like I can't remember now if it was the fourth crossing. There are trails that were so established as social trails, they just became real trails because they were routes that people would use. So then it just became a maintained trail, which also limited the impacts overall. There were introductions of new waysides so that people had a spot to sit, so they weren't just wandering off in the meadow to sit because they just really needed a break. So there's a really holistic way to think about, well, what do we do to preserve the meadow system? And so that led to both this restoration, this is a sunrise, it's just a good restoration picture, and then and to thinking about why people are going off trails. And there were studies of that showed that, well, finding people will stop them from going off trails, but also having a uniform presence on the meadow trails would help people stop going off trails, because some people just didn't know what they were doing. And it can be confusing up in Paradise sometimes to even know where you're at. So that was in part what led to the Meadow Rovers program, because it's so critical to keeping people on trail and preventing further impacts. And then it also developed those erosion potentials categorized impacts so that the worst impacts could be fixed first, essentially, and then on down the line. So our restoration, the way we do restoration now is we use all native plants from the area. So if we're doing restoration in paradise, we're using seeds or cuttings collected there. By Josh having a greenhouse and their staff, and a couple of years ago, collected some seeds up at paradise to be planted. Then for the most part right now, those plants all get grown in the greenhouse, so we're not generally directly seeding it right now. They get grown as seedlings in the greenhouse and then brought up to paradise. So this year, for the restoration planting, Josh and his staff have grown 47,000 seedlings to plant up in the meadows, which is pretty incredible. I think at least 17 different species. So it's a pretty good start for an impacted spot. And so that restoration work has taken various shapes over time. So some of it was rough seeding. We flew in soil in helicopters in mass to some of the worst sites. And so over time, there's actually been a ton of restoration on that network. So all these green spots are areas where there's been some form of restoration, whether it be just like adding a bunch of soil and stabilizing it so it wasn't, a 5-foot deep pit anymore, to seeding to growing plants. That means this is the types of, this is the severity. So the top bar are the most critical trails documented in that Paradise Meadow plan, and the low bar are the least critical. So, okay, maybe somebody walked out there, but it would probably be fine. And the green is any sort of restoration that happened there. So the most critical trails, at least 75% of them had at least some restoration. The very high, at least 50%. So I think we're getting there. And I think one thing that's just hard is that there are so many impacts that it means almost 30 years later, there's still a lot of pain here. And so we have to kind of decide, well, what are we going to do next? How are we going to carry forward all of this effort from restoration, from rovers on the ground, from people roping and pulling off areas so people know not to walk there. So this year, all of our restoration is happening primarily at Dead Horse Creek, and then eventually we'll work our way up, not this year, but probably next year, to where the trails crew is rerouting the trail at Marmot Hill, and we'll help restore the old trail bed, so it will look like new, hopefully. I have my mindset on like a lot of monkey flowers or something along that little stream. And this big area here, which is right next to the boulder that has a sign about how restoration works, so I love it. It's just a perfect, it's already got the interp ready, is where the crew is planting now. And actually they have a group from the Mount Rainier National Park Associates out today. And it's a really big impacted area. And so here is a crew planting as of just a couple weeks ago. And what we're going to do as part of this work is also implement some adaptive restoration experiments. So there's a pretty rich history here of testing out restoration techniques in the park. So trying out direct seeding, trying out mulching techniques. And we think it's time to maybe like restart that testing, especially because we know that the environment has changed a little bit, right? The conditions in which plants grow are a little bit different now. Snow's melting a little bit earlier, maybe there's more rain earlier. So it's time to make sure that we're still using the best restoration techniques we can. So we have luckily, Dr. John Walker at the University of Washington has helped us start to develop an adaptive restoration plan. And so this year, we're included in our standard planting. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Is there a way to get involved in that? I've tried for the last couple of years, but never quite made it to the right person to get a response. But
To what?
I'd love to be involved in that, and
In
I
the
don't know how to
restoration?
get involved. I've tried
Just to like go plant?
the restoration.
Yeah. You want to go like plant? Yeah.
Plant or help grow in the greenhouse, either
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, well, talk to me after and I'll take
Okay.
your information. Yeah. Yeah, we have a lot of volunteers to help planting, and that's a fun way to get involved for us to see how it works. And then, yeah, we have an incredible greenhouse that Josh runs here.
I've had the the same experience for a couple of years. Same, and specifically, thought they would be willing to work in greenhouse or some kind of function over the winter, maybe would be good. And I never hear anything.
Yeah, I was told to email this person or that person and never get a response.
Okay. Well, I can certainly, I do know the greenhouses, there's often not as much going on in the winter, so there's not as much to do. But certainly for restoration planting, there's usually opportunities to come volunteer. And it is really fun thing to do, and the crew is great at what they do. They're fun to work with.
You said that it was the National Park Association, that Mount Rainier Association?
Yeah, the Mount Rainier National Park Association is volunteering.
Associates.
today. Associates, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Associates.
But they're not the ones that are in charge of the restoration?
No.
No. They have monthly work parties, and one of them each year is re-veg.
Yeah, no, so the restoration happens in the vegetation program, and Kim Popak leads the restoration on the ground, and then Josh grows all the plants, so we run it within the park, yeah. Yeah,
Aren't there several volunteer days this weekend, or weekends this?
Yes, there are, and I can make sure we can get that, I can send that information to you to share too. Sometimes they're groups, but they're often, like, there's National Public Lands Day, which I think is kind of just like, you want to come plant.
Well, she actually said there's a limit of 20 people.
Oh,
so-
well, that's right.
Yeah, so it's, unfortunately, some of it has to do with staffing to oversee
Yeah.
and instruct and kind of make sure things are happening the way they should be.
Yeah.
And we're a little bit low on staff this year still because of COVID, so that may be impacting
Thanks for
things
that.
as well.
Sorry, I was over enthusiastic.
Yeah.
But we can make the connection, and if it doesn't work out this year, I think it will be, I mean, we have to be post-COVID at some point. Yeah, we have no shortage of areas to plant. So this year, we're going to set up these adaptive restoration experiments. So it means that just within the planting itself, we're going to try out some techniques that we think will work at least a little bit, but will let us keep planting. So it's adaptive in that we plant there, and then we can change things as we go rather than, setting up a whole experiment and waiting years to see what's best and then do the work. So we're going to plant in these different densities. This is the way we often plant, little clusters of plants and then another little cluster of plants to sort of mimic the diversity on the landscape. Really low density, maybe that will just create some space for some new plants to come in. And then super high density, because we know that plants can both compete with one another. Of course, like they all need nutrients, their roots have to spread, they have to have sun, but they also can be really facilitative with one another. So sometimes having more diversity in an area, well, almost always having more diversity in an area, but sometimes having even close neighbors helps you stay a little warmer, means potentially less likely you'll get eaten, creates a little bit more moisture on the surface, the soil shading, and that can actually help plants grow. And in really harsh environments, there's sometimes as much facilitation as there is competition. I think there's been a lot of focus on competition in ecology because it's like inherently easy to understand, maybe from like a Western viewpoint, but facilitation can be really important too. And then we're also going to mulch them primarily with wood shavings from the park, but also with some amendments to the wood shaving to see if that will help change soil moisture. So we'll have all these plots, but spread out, so hopefully they won't be too apparent on the landscape that we can monitor over time, where we have our low and high density and mulched and not mulched. And then we'll monitor the plant survival of both over time. And we're also going to add some mulch and seed amendments, especially lupin, to some pre-existing plantings right there. So this is a picture taken this year of plants that were planted in 2018. And they're actually, we have a really high survival, but they are not big. So this is a 1 by 1 meter square. So these little plants are just really, really little, and they're hanging on. And so we're hoping that maybe, if we throw some lupin in there, if we throw some mulch in there, that will help them get a little bit bigger. And something that is more and more apparent to me as I spend time in the meadows, and it might be really obvious if you are helping try to keep people on the trails in the meadows, is that having bigger plants is important so that people think that there's something there. So we can't necessarily make the plants grow all that fast because they're slow growing subalpine, alpine plants, but every little bit might help it look a bit more like a meadow and maybe people won't want to stand up. Though we were at the site a week ago and someone asked, well, how do I go stand in the meadow? We don't want you to stand in the meadow. That's so dumb. You have a question?
Will these potentially be identifiable? It would seem really helpful in talking to visitors is to point and say, okay, this is an area that we're trying to restore and stay off of so that you can see it.
Yeah.
It'd be better.
Yeah, I have to send something to Interd and I'll share it with you too, but the plots will be identifiable probably because it's going to be like a high density and then a low density. And I actually have two set up so they're right near the trail, thinking that actually it might be helpful that they're more identified, like it's a little science. And it'll be planted all around it, so it won't be just like bare space and then the plots, it'll be planted and then some things will look a little different, it'll be mulch or not. And then we are marking them with nails, so the nails will probably be mostly in the ground so that we can find where to put this each year to put it out.
Okay.
But yeah.
It's very helpful to take a visitor and point at things.
Yeah.
And let them see.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting. We probably should sign it better because when we plant up there, when we first started planting, it's like, looks so lush. Like those plants just came from the greenhouse. They're only like, I don't know, 3 or 4 months old. Some of them are flowering already and you're like, don't do that quite yet. And it really fills the space. And then all that above ground tissue just dies back and it does not come back the same way. But so when they first plant, it kind of looks like it's fixed, you know? And they don't realize that like 3, 4 years later, it's gonna look like this. And it's not gonna look like that rest of that meadow space. Like you can see all the non-impacted meadow was, you know, almost a foot tall. It's just like really packed in there. It's lupin, it's lucia, there's some carex, there's juncus, there's the past flower, just like all packed in that space, and then there's just like nothing out here, and even if they plant in there, it's gonna look a lot more like this than that mature meadow for, I don't know, 20 years, like a really long time, yeah. Yeah,
Anything that helps involve the visitors in that process
Yeah.
is very helpful.
Yeah, I almost wonder, and we talked about this a little bit for after they do the Ohana Prakash campground, we're going to plant out some plants, and the greenhouse staff are growing plants to plant, you know, between campgrounds, so there's a little bit more privacy and it looks a little bit more like the natural forest understory. And we talked about putting signs about not stopping there, you know, and well, maybe we should have a sign like when they cut like timberland, and then they post, oh, planted in 1982. So you have a real reference of like, oh, okay, those trees are 30 years, 40 years old. I know what that, and now I know what a 40-year-old tree looks like. Because I think people would be surprised if this is all that's happened in 3 years. And it might not look that different in, you know, 5 more years, so.
There's a couple areas in the Sunrise area in particular where it's very clear where it's been restored, and you can just see, and it was like 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And there's also, for those of you familiar with Sunrise, when you're in the visitor center area, you look up towards Degay Peak on that hillside there, and there's 2 very clear strips. And that was a horse trail when they were riding horses up there. That was restored something like 70 years ago, and you can still see the markings.
Yeah.
Well, the plantings at Paradise around the visitor center, those were all within a year or 2 of the visitor center being built.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, those look really good.
Yeah, a lot of that was stuff that was salvaged.
Yeah,
The biggest.
yeah, maybe that's why they just have big, yeah, because it just, those look really nice, and we're actually talking about that with the lupins, because Josh was recounting that they just put a bunch of lupins out there, and then all the lupins germinated, and for a brief period of time, they thought, oh no, lupins had took it up, and then the lupins died back, and the other plants were still there, so that's what we're going to try a little bit here, which is like, oh, maybe we can kind of like amend the soil with some other seeds and and get it to fill in too and be a little bit more diverse than Juncus, Lucia, Veronica, Juncus, Lucia, Veronica. Yeah. Yeah, it would be.
I have to scoot out, but please don't forget to sign in. And thanks for coming. And please continue. Oh, sorry, I have to leave in the middle. I have another group.
Thank you. Okay, and then a last thing we're going to try up there that I'm excited we just got funding for is thinking about, okay, the last mapping of these impacts in Paradise was in 1986 and 1987. So most of the people that are doing the planting work and restoration work were not alive when those impacts were mapped. And so we don't have an updated like prioritization, like that plan led to like this is the worst, do it first. This is the second worst, do it second. This looks bad, but it's actually not the most bad. So don't deal with this impact. So what we're going to try now is to use modern technology, so use the satellite imagery or drone imagery, or one of the geology texts has organized a structure from motion flight over the park, which gives both like a really nice photo of the park, but also like heights of things. They're doing it for geology reasons, but I'm really hoping we can use it for plant reasons, and use that to sort of use more machine learning approach to see if we can outline where these impacts are in the Paradise landscape and help us reprioritize our approach. So a researcher at the University of Washington, Megan Halabisky, is going to attempt to start doing that as a trial run next year. And this plot here shows, so the most critical impacts mapped in 1986, it shows the width of the trails. And so we can get imagery that even if it was like half a meter resolution, so each pixel was half a meter, we can maybe detect 65% of the impacts, but we can get better imagery than that. So we're really hopeful that we can start to maybe like automate the detection over time of these impacts, which also would let us know, oh, that's restored. It actually it's not detectable anymore, versus, oh, this is something new that's happening in the meadow. We better take care of it. Because right now, a lot of those reports come in from frustrated rangers or rovers or visitors who are like, oh, it's getting so bad up here. We need to do something about it. And we're just responding sort of reactively to everything. And hoping we can inform our data so that we're responding more proactively or in a more systematic way to impacts in the future. Well, that is all I have for you all today. Do you have any questions? No.
Are impacts detected in the summer or the spring? One of the issues that at least I run into a lot is spring when it's like partially melted out. The real trail is covered in snow,
Yeah.
and it's a lot safer for the person to walk outside the trail.
Yeah.
So that's where the social trails get formed.
Yeah.
And I know as a rover, at some point you decide, okay, visitor safety trumps things and just go there. But understanding, maybe you leave it as is, or somebody brings a shovel, or the strategy to that's a problem that comes up a lot.
Yeah, and I know I'm still not completely familiar with like that seasonal impact. I know that there's been like little bits of discussion here and there about having a new and like revised sort of big like restore Paradise plan again. Think about, well, if it's if a trail's going to be rerouted, should we take into account snow melt timing and landscape so that it is really going to be
If it's
the
safer
easiest
for the
place.
person to stay on the trail.
Yeah.
Golden Gate comes to mind.
Yeah, and I think when they're the reroute on Marmot Hill, part of the reason they're changing it, well, because it's basically a creek now, and so people don't walk in it anyway, but also part of it will melt out a lot earlier, so it'll just be easier for people to stay on the trail. Yeah, I think there's also been talk about as trails get fixed, widening them, so that the impact of just the stepping off the trail, maybe that won't happen because they won't need to. So I think you're right, there needs to be kind of a, not just like how do we restore, or how do we rope and pull, or how do we get more staff and volunteers up there to remind people where to be, but also how do you make it easy for people to just do what we want them to do?
That's an issue rovers will run into
Yeah,
in terms of people trying to come down the snow and, where do you help lead them?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it's even hard if you see a family just taking a rest and they're on rocks and they're technically right off the trail, but it's already impacted there. It does feel a little bit like,
Yeah,
like if you just don't go anywhere else. Yeah, I think there's that sociological element too of how to manage people that I haven't totally wrapped my head around, other than just be like, oh, this is a big gnarly problem. Yeah.
Even though it looks like it's just dirt, and it's off the trail, I always very nicely ask them to step back and tell them it's expanding there, so it's just an awareness thing.
Yeah.
But the thing that I found the most common off the trail activities and people are taking pictures of the flowers and also mostly of themselves in the midst of flowers.
Yeah.
It'd almost be nice to have some places that are actual developed trails, maybe a little bit like little offshoots so that people
Yeah.
can stand
Yeah.
in amidst the flowers, or not in amidst them, but so the picture will look like that.
Yeah.
Because they're not trying to be careless or anything,
Yeah.
they just love taking pictures of themselves up there.
Yeah, and I don't think people have an inherent understanding, like, you don't understand, it's like 7 footsteps, like 7 passes on this heather will kill us.
Well,
Right?
I always talk to them about
Yeah.
that in a very friendly way, and
Yeah.
all that, especially for the kids. But I do think that it's perfectly human and natural that they want to have pictures of themselves, and they don't want to take a picture on the trip.
Yeah.
And there's never any place really where they can do that.
Yeah. What do you say to them when they're in the
I
meadow?
say, oh, there you are, you're not on the trail, and it's just like, they're kids sometimes.
Yeah.
And I say, okay, come this way, and I know it's just so tempting to want to stand over there, but believe it or not, and step on these flowers and these plants that makes it very hard for them to come back next year, and you don't want to have that, so, and then I chat with them, I think, so they don't feel like they've been punished.
No, that's good. I don't think I've really mastered the non-chastising way of just like, get off the meadows.
Well, yeah, so far I've been successful, there's nobody who's refused.
That's good. Yeah. No, I really thank you for doing that work. It's like, it's really challenging for me to try to have those conversations. Like, just still my plants, please. It's not very educational.
It always ends up in the educational world because
Yeah.
it's a good opportunity, because they don't know that.
Yeah.
So they've learned something.
Yeah, and there's that term, I don't like the kind of like the ignorance of plants, but I think that it kind of applies to a lot of the natural world. It's just that like they're just background, like they're just this background beings, and they're like, they're not really, like there's just not this understanding maybe that they're living, that they're long living. I definitely see people stomp on plants up on like furrows and they're like, oh, those plants are
Yeah.
probably so old.
Well, I never want them to feel like they've been corrected, I want them to feel like they've learned something.
Yeah,
They
Yeah.
usually seem to,
that's great. That's
but I
great.
still think there ought to be some way for people to be able to be out a little bit more
Yeah.
photo opportunities.
Yeah, I worry about like if we make more like inlets, that we'll just, like one thing we're thinking about for the visitor use management plan is using the number of off-trail impacts as sort of an indicator of the resource level, the resource status basically, with more impacts or more inlets, so there's like the patches on impacted meadows get smaller and smaller. That would be an indicator that there's too many people, or we need to change how people are moving in the meadow. And I think like, oh, each little inlet you made But I do think, I was thinking like there are places where like on the switchbacks and the trails, if we put, this is a good photo point, if someone
Yeah.
stood like down on the switchback and the person taking the photo stood up, they would look like they were knee deep in a meadow. And it's like, I wonder, I mentioned that someone else will be like, oh, you're just like spoon feeding them where to go. It's like, yeah, but then they can
Yeah,
get
they
the
just-
photo and they get the mountain and they get their like, the liftings up to their knees and it will look great and they won't be standing, you know, in the meadow.
But it helps them to satisfy that, their desire to be normal and understandable.
Yeah.
And also, it's a little bit educational in and of itself because it shows them that here's a place where it's okay to stay in, but it's
Yeah.
not standing on it.
I like that. I do like the idea. Something to like let them get what they want without stomping all over the meadows.
A photo station.
Yeah.
Well, continuing on the educational idea, I think parts of this presentation would be great at some of the evening presentations at the campgrounds, where they can see the scars, talk about restoration, and then they can, hopefully, get all of this, and then we won't have to keep, can you come back on the track?
Yeah.
Because it's really visual, and
Yeah.
you really see what's going on, and the whole process of the restoration and what needs to happen to fix things.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming in. Is anyone going for a hike now? Or yeah. No.
Thank you.